Hey ladies, so today I'm going to show you how to do some slow shading with your portrait. Now slow shading is a little bit different from the hatching, cross-hatching, and stippling that we were doing before. It's just like it sounds, it's slow shading. So it is a process, but if you kind of get yourself into a meditative state while you're doing it, it can actually be quite enjoyable and relaxing. Some materials that you are going to need are a number 2 pencil. Now, if you have fancy art pencils, I recommend using a HB pencil. That's pretty much the same thing as a number 2 pencil. And then you can use a 2B or a 4B. These are just darker pencils, so they'll give you slightly darker graphite when you press onto the paper. The next thing you'll need is an eraser. I really like to use block erasers, but the pencil eraser that you have is fine. Just make sure that your eraser isn't too hard, because if the eraser is hard, it's going to smudge your pencil marks on your paper. So make sure that the eraser can erase well. Test it out first on another piece of paper. And the next thing that you're going to need is a blending tool. If you have a tortillon stump, that's awesome, but you can also use something like a balled up tissue paper or paper towel. Anything that's just really tightly wrapped. The tighter you can wrap it, the better, because that will more mimic the consistency of a blending stump. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So I like to start with the eye. That's just my personal preference. If you have another spot that you'd like to start, that's fine. I don't know why, I just feel like the eye is a good place to start because there's so many different values going on. What you're really going for here is contrast of value. So you really want your light areas to pop out and you really want your dark areas to be very dark. Now it can be tricky when you're using a regular number 2 pencil to get very, very dark values, but we will do our best here. The thing about slow shading is that you're not exactly avoiding areas of highlight just yet. Notice how her nose, it has this highlight at the tip, and then there's really dark shadows in the nostrils, and then there's sort of a highlight on the bridge of her nose. I'm actually going to ignore the highlights for a moment. I'm just going to do a light shade of gray over the entire nose area. Now just a reminder about holding your pencil. You want to kind of let it rest in your hand. You don't want to grip it really tight like you're writing like a pen. You want to just kind of let it rest on top of your middle finger being cradled by your pointer finger and your thumb. And you don't want to move your whole wrist like this. You want to just move your fingers in this sort of side to side motion, really letting your knuckles do all of the work here. Now you might notice them following along with the contour of her nose. I'm not just doing random swirls or zigzags going from side to side. I'm actively trying to look at the shape of her nose, imagining that the sides of her nostrils are roundish. So I'm kind of recreating that round shape here as I'm kind of curving the pencil back and forth to mimic that rounded shape. This will help you to create implied form in your drawing. If you follow along, think about a cross contour drawing where you imagine like rubber bands wrapped around something, hugging the contour. That's what you're doing with your pencil here. Imagining that the nose area is roundish and sort of wrapping your pencil around there. And I'm doing the same thing as I travel up the nose here. Thinking about the shape of the bridge of the nose. Going up on the other side as well. Mimicking that shape. And remember, I'm completely ignoring where light areas are and dark areas are right now. It kind of just looks like I'm shading in just the dark areas, but look, I'm going over top of where that highlight is. I'm going to go back in and add that later. Now I see darker shadows in some areas, but I'm kind of just ignoring them for right now. I'm just doing the same mid-tone of gray over the whole nose area. And you can do this over the whole face at this stage. You don't necessarily have to work on the nose and finish that, the mouth and finish that. I'm just doing it one piece at a time though. That's just how I like to do things. So I'm looking and noticing that there is a highlight right here in the center part of the bridge of the nose. Now, before I start erasing those highlights, I'm going to start to push those darker values. And before I go with darker values, I'm just going to blend everything out, just so that all of the lines are nice and even, the tones are even, you don't see a lot of streaks, pencil marks. And noticing them still going around the contour of the face. There's that ball of the nose, that tip of the nose right there. I'm kind of swirling around it to help give it more implied form. And same thing with the sides of the nose. From the bridge of our nose, it kind of slopes out as it goes towards our cheeks. Remember to use the gentlest touch here, not pressing too hard or else you'll get big streaks and smudges. You want everything to be very nicely blended, and that requires a nice, gentle touch. Okay, so I'm going to start coming in here and adding in even darker values. So not pushing all the way yet for the very dark values, but just sort of building upon what I have right now. Still not pressing too hard, just slightly harder than I was before. And that's where the slow shading aspect comes in. You build up those darker values slowly. And remember, you're still just moving your fingers, not moving your wrist back and forth. I'm noticing that there's a really dark area in here, right under that brow bone. But I'm just making it slightly darker, not pushing too hard just yet. Now remember that the denser the lines are, and the more pressure you use, the darker things are going to get. So work in stages. And it's okay to blend along the way too, if you want to see how something looks blended before you proceed. And then I'm actually going to darken up her nostrils really quick. They are very, very dark in the photo. So I'm just going to go ahead and add in that dark value. It'll kind of help me establish some of the other values and make sure I'm not going too dark with them or too light. Sometimes it can be helpful to get those really dark areas out of the way. Things like the pupils, the rings around the irises. And then I'm just going to lightly go over other areas that should be a little bit darker. Still building in layers. And once you've got all of your values set with your layers, you can go ahead and blend things out. Remember not to blend too far and wide. Try to just keep your blending contained in one area, following along with the contours of the face. Okay, so now we're going to start working on the highlights. What I like to do is I like to just go right onto my reference photo and trace shapes around the highlights, just so I can kind of get a more concrete idea of what kind of shape I'm going to be making with my eraser. Then when you're erasing, just tap the paper ever so gently. Make sure you're cleaning off your eraser often, because it will build up with graphite and it just won't work as well. But just very, very lightly tap the paper. Little by little, you'll take off more and more pencil, and you'll start getting that highlight shape that you're looking for. So I'm just trying to recreate that shape that I'm seeing. I'm looking for smaller highlights as well. You'll notice the big obvious highlights, but look for those little tiny ones. Especially under the eyes, you might notice that wrinkles create little highlights. Instead of just using harsh, dark lines for wrinkles, try to use little highlights instead. You'll usually get some closer realism. You want to blend out your highlight, but be careful not to blend too much. Like I went a little too much blending there and it kind of took some of my highlight off. But that's fine. It's good to work in layers like that. You can use your finger to blend as well, to be a little bit more careful. And just keep building upon that. Now that I've got some highlights going on, I'm just going to go in there with my slightly darker pencil. Again, if you're using a regular number 2 pencil, you might just need to press harder to get really dark values. But I'm just going to go in here and add a few more really dark shadows wherever I see them, just to really push that contrast. One thing that you can do if you have paintbrushes on hand is you can actually use a really tiny paintbrush. Doesn't have to be too tiny probably, but a good size to just do some blending in some really hard to reach areas. I find that the paintbrush is super gentle and it won't smear or cause streaks in your blending. So if you have one, you're welcome to use it. I certainly enjoy using it just because I have them on hand. One big tip that I have is to use something like a tissue to brush off any eraser pieces or shavings that you might have. You don't want to use the side of your hand and rub it on your paper because you might smear your pencil. So that's pretty much it for how slow shading works. Just to kind of review what we talked about here, you want to make sure that you're very, very lightly laying down an even layer of pencil and then sort of blending out as you go. Make sure that you're following along with the contours of the face, and that includes when you're both using the pencil and when you are using the blending tool that you choose to use. When you notice very dark values, don't go super dark with your pencil right away. Kind of build your way up towards that darkness, starting with a very light pressure of the pencil and then working your way darker. And then when you notice things like highlights, use your eraser and just very, very gently tap the paper. Don't try to take everything off right away. Just start in small, gradual increments. See how it looks. You can always add more pencil back and you can always take more off. Again, it's all about working slowly and just being patient. And when you're finished, you will have a beautiful final product.